The road outside Regensburg on the morning of April 22, 1945, had the particular silence of a place where ordinary life had simply stopped. Not the silence of a countryside at peace, with its birds and wind moving through fields, but something harder and more final. The silence of absence, of buildings standing with their windows dark, of a highway built to carry convoys and columns now carrying almost nothing. A light rain had come and gone before dawn, and the asphalt was still damp, catching the pale morning light in thin reflections. Along its broken shoulder, a group of 14 German women walked westward. Not marching, walking. The distinction mattered. There was no formation, no officer at the front calling cadence, no sense that this movement had an origin point or a destination. There was only the direction and the road and the sound of their boots on wet pavement. Ilse Bauer walked near the middle of the group, her hands tucked into the pockets of a wool coat that had once fit her properly and now hung loose at the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the cut of the fabric. She was 26 years old, originally from Munich, the daughter of a clockmaker whose small shop near the Marienplatz had been one of those quiet neighborhood businesses that seemed to exist outside the logic of history, unchanged year after year, smelling of metal oil and old wood, with a glass case full of mechanisms that most customers would never understand. Her father had died of a heart attack in the spring of 1942, which meant he did not live to see the worst of what followed. And Ilse had sometimes caught herself thinking that this was perhaps the one thing in recent years that could be called fortunate. She had studied literature at the university for 2 years before the money ran out, and then she had taken a clerical position in a Wehrmacht supply office outside Nuremberg, where she had spent 18 months recording the movement of goods that no longer existed, typing inventory numbers onto forms that described a war machine that bore increasingly little resemblance to reality. The work had been monotonous in a way that she had once found oppressive and had since come to understand as a kind of mercy. Monotony, she had learned, was not something to complain about. Walking a few steps behind her was Kathy Richter, 34, from Frankfurt, a trained nurse who had worked in a field hospital near the Eastern Front until the autumn of 1944, when a piece of shrapnel from a Soviet artillery shell found its way through an inadequate wall and into her left shoulder. The wound had healed, functionally, but not completely. She had lost some range of motion and the kind of endurance that surgery required, and so she had been reassigned to administrative duties, which she performed with the same careful attention she had once given to wound care and medication charts. Kathy was not a woman who spoke more than necessary, and the other women in the group had learned this about her quickly. What she did instead of speaking was observe, and what she had been observing for the past several days was an army in the process of ceasing to be an army. Officers leaving in staff cars without orders. Supply depots standing open, their contents already taken or simply abandoned. Soldiers she passed on side roads no longer wearing their rank insignia. She noted all of this the way she had once noted a patient's temperature, without visible reaction, but with full understanding of what the numbers meant. The youngest of the group, walking close to Kathy as though proximity offered some form of protection, was Hilda Schreiber, 21, from a village in Saxony small enough that she could name every family in it. She had been drafted the previous summer and had spent most of her service time assigned to anti-aircraft units that had very little to fire at, because the aircraft they were designed to target had largely stopped appearing. She was not a soldier in any meaningful sense of the word. She was a young woman from a small place who had been handed a uniform and a role and told to perform it, and she had done so as faithfully as she knew how. The fear she carried was not complicated or layered. It sat on the surface of her face, and she had not yet learned to move it somewhere less visible. And then there was Marta Vogel, 38, walking at the rear of the column with the measured pace of someone who had already decided that hurrying changed nothing. Marta was from Dresden. She did not speak about Dresden unless someone asked directly, and even then she kept her answers short, and the women around her had developed the sensitivity to understand that this was not coldness but something closer to self-preservation. Her husband was alive, somewhere in Hungary with the remnants of a mechanized division. Whether that was still true on April 22, 1945, she did not know, and this uncertainty had become such a constant condition of her existence that it had settled into something almost indistinguishable from ordinary thought. What these four women shared, Beyond their worn uniforms and their westward direction on a wet April road was a framework of belief about what was coming. Not hope, not plans. Belief, the specific, instructed kind that had been built into them over years through newspapers, radio broadcasts, official statements, and the quiet but persistent pressure of an entire society organized around a particular story about the world. The story said many things, but in the context of what was approaching from the West, it said this: the Americans were not a civilized military force in any European sense. They were undisciplined, their ranks mixed in ways that German military doctrine would never permit. And among the units advancing through southern Germany were soldiers from populations that the regime's propaganda had spent years describing with a specific and ugly vocabulary. Black soldiers, colonial troops, men who, according to the official narrative, represented a threat of an elemental and uncivilized nature. The posters had been explicit, the radio had been consistent, and in the absence of any other source of information, what the posters and the radio said had simply become what was true. Ilse did not consider herself a committed ideologue. She had joined no party organizations beyond what was required. She had found the more extreme expressions of official doctrine uncomfortable in the private part of her mind that she kept separate from everything else. But she believed the essentials, or something close enough to believing them that the distinction was academic. She believed that capture by American forces, and in particular by certain American units, would mean a loss of safety. She was not entirely sure what form that would take. The propaganda had been vivid but not specific. It implied rather than described. And implication, she had found, was often more powerful than description because it allowed the imagination to construct its own version of the worst. Kathy held her beliefs differently, not as fear, but as a professional assessment. She had worked with German military medicine long enough to have a concrete understanding of what adequate medical care looked like and what inadequate care produced. The propaganda had told her that American medical practice was inferior, that their field hospitals were disorganized, that treatment of prisoners was inconsistent at best. What happened to German military women in American captivity was, according to what she had heard from officers during the retreat, essentially uncertain. This uncertainty was its own form of information, and the information it conveyed was that she should expect nothing reliable. Hilda simply believed what she had been told because she had not been given anything else to believe. The black soldiers in American ranks were the detail that frightened her most specifically. She had seen the propaganda illustrations in a schoolroom in Saxony 4 years ago, and the images had lodged in her memory in the way that images shown to young people during impressionable years tend to lodge, not necessarily as conscious thought, but as a kind of background assumption about the shape of the world. They heard the trucks before they saw them. A low mechanical sound coming from around a bend in the road, growing without urgency, steady and purposeful. The women slowed almost simultaneously without anyone giving an instruction to slow. Ilse felt something shift in her chest. Not panic, not yet, but a tightening, a physical acknowledgement that the thing they had been moving toward or away from, depending on how you understood their direction, was about to present itself. The first vehicle that appeared around the bend was a Jeep. Olive drab, a white star painted on its hood, 2 soldiers in the front seat. American. Behind it came a truck, then another Jeep, then 2 more trucks. The column stopped. The soldiers dismounted without particular haste. Their movements were efficient and professional. One of them, a sergeant with a clipboard, called out in German that was accented but entirely functional. He told them to keep their hands visible, to state their unit designation and rank, that they were under the protection of the Geneva Convention and would not be harmed. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who had done this procedure many times and understood that calm transmission of information was more useful than any other register. Ilse raised her hands and looked at the man beside him, a soldier standing with a rifle slung across his chest, watching the group with a steady and patient expression. He was black, the first black soldier she had ever seen in person. She looked at him for exactly as long as she could before her eyes moved elsewhere, and in that brief interval, she was aware of a strange and disorienting gap between what she had expected to see and what she was actually seeing. A soldier in a clean uniform, a man standing in a posture that suggested boredom more than aggression, or perhaps patience, the patience of someone who had been standing in the same posture through many similar events on many similar roads. He was not looking at her specifically. He was watching the group, professionally and without expression, and then he shifted his weight from one foot to the other and glanced down the road in the direction the vehicles had come from. Her hands were still raised. The sergeant with the clipboard was writing something. The rain from earlier had left the air smelling of wet earth and diesel, and somewhere beyond the tree line to the north a bird was making a sound that had nothing to do with any of what was happening on the road. Ilsa became aware that she was breathing in a way that was slightly too fast, and she made a deliberate effort to slow it. Behind her, she heard Hilda make a sound that was almost a word, but not quite. Kathy said nothing. Marta, at the rear, lowered her hands when the sergeant indicated they could lower their hands, and did so with the same quiet economy she applied to everything else. They were prisoners now. The forms were being filled in. The trucks were idling. And the soldier in the clean uniform was still watching the tree line to the north, still patient, still entirely indifferent to the catastrophe of ideology that had just collided with the simple fact of his presence on a road in Bavaria in April 1945. The processing took most of the morning. They were moved off the road and into a farmyard that the Americans had apparently been using as a temporary collection point for some days. There were other German prisoners already there, mostly men seated in groups along a stone wall, and a handful of women near a barn who looked as though they had been waiting since the previous day. The farmyard itself was unremarkable, the kind of Bavarian property that had been producing the same crops and housing the same livestock for generations, though the livestock were gone now and the fields beyond the fence had not been planted. A folding table had been set up near the barn door with 2 American soldiers behind it, one writing, one asking questions through a young German-speaking corporal who could not have been more than 20 and who translated with the focused concentration of someone working at the edge of his ability. Ilsa stood in the line and watched the process move forward, one woman at a time. Name, age, unit, rank. The questions were asked in the same order for each person, and the answers were written down in the same order, and then the next person stepped forward. There was nothing punitive in the procedure. There was nothing humiliating. It was administrative, thorough, and indistinct from any other bureaucratic intake process except for the language and the uniforms involved. When Ilsa reached the table, she gave her name and her information, and the young corporal wrote it down, and the soldier beside him added something in English, and then she was directed toward the barn, where the women were being held separately from the men. The barn smelled of old straw and animal absence, the particular dry smell of a space that had housed living things and no longer did. Someone had arranged wooden crates into something resembling seating along one wall, and there was a kerosene lantern hanging from a beam, though it was not yet lit, because the morning light coming through the gaps in the planking was sufficient. Several American soldiers stood at the entrance and along the outer wall, and they stood there with the patient, uninvested quality that Ilsa was beginning to associate specifically with American military men. A kind of professional neutrality that was neither friendly nor hostile, but simply present, attending to a task without apparent personal investment in any particular outcome. Kathy sat on one of the crates near the wall with her back straight and her hands on her knees. She had said almost nothing since the moment on the road. Hilda sat close beside her and had said too much, a continuous quiet stream of observation and question and half-finished sentence that she herself seemed unable to stop. Marta had found a corner slightly apart from the others and was sitting with her eyes open, looking at nothing in particular. Ilsa took a place between Kathy and Hilda and tried to organize what she was observing into something coherent. The soldiers outside were rotating in short intervals, 2 entering as 2 left, which suggested they were working in shifts even in this temporary setting. One of those who entered and took a position near the barn door was a black soldier, perhaps 25, with a rifle slung in the same manner as every other soldier she had seen that morning. He stood with his feet at shoulder width and his arms loose at his sides, and he looked at the women in the barn with the same mild professional attention that his colleagues displayed, which is to say that he looked at them as his responsibility rather than as individuals, scanning the space periodically the way a person does when their job is to make sure nothing has changed rather than to engage with anything specifically. He was not the same man from the road. He was different, shorter, with a rounder face. And like the man from the road, he did not match in any visible way the image that the propaganda had constructed. He looked tired, frankly. He looked like a man who had been working long hours in the field and would prefer to be somewhere with a chair and a hot meal. Hilda stopped talking. Ilsa noticed this not because the silence was complete, but because Hilda's particular thread of anxious narration ceased, and the quality of her silence was the silence of someone looking at something that is requiring all of her attention. Ilsa followed Hilda's line of sight to the soldier at the door. He had not moved. He was simply standing there. And what Ilsa saw on Hilda's face, in the moment before Hilda looked away, was not terror. It was something more complicated, a kind of confused waiting, as though the fear she had been carrying in anticipation of this moment had prepared her for something specific that was not, in fact, occurring, and she did not yet know what to do with the difference. They remained in the barn for most of the afternoon. At midday, 2 soldiers came in carrying a large metal container of soup and a stack of tin cups, and they set these things down near the entrance, and one of them said something in English that the young corporal translated as "The food is for you. Help yourselves." The soup was a thick broth with pieces of potato and something that may have been tinned beef. It was hot. Several women hesitated before taking a cup, and Ilsa was among them. Not because she thought the food was poisoned, exactly, but because accepting it required a small recalibration of expectation that her mind performed slowly, reluctantly. She had not eaten since the previous evening. The soup was plain but adequate, and she finished the cup and was aware that she would have accepted more if it had been offered. Kathy took her soup without hesitation and drank it with the efficiency of a medical professional who understood that nutrition was a clinical matter and that ideological discomfort was not a reason to refuse it. She watched the distribution process with her characteristic attention. The soldiers who had brought the food waited near the entrance without urgency, and when a woman near the far wall dropped her cup and spilled what was in it, one of the soldiers picked up the cup and refilled it from the container and handed it back. No comment, no expression of displeasure. He simply replaced what had been lost and returned to where he had been standing. Kathy saw this and said nothing. But Ilsa, sitting beside her, was close enough to see Kathy's eyes move from the soldier to the container to the woman who had dropped her cup and back to the soldier again. In the way that Kathy looked at things, she was processing carefully. By late afternoon, the farmyard had grown quieter. Most of the male prisoners had been transported elsewhere. The women were told, through the young corporal, that they would be moving the following morning to a more permanent holding facility, that they should sleep in the barn, that there were blankets available from a supply crate near the door. The blankets were thick and slightly rough, the kind of institutional wool that held warmth reliably, if not comfortably. Ilsa took one and folded it under her head as a pillow and lay on a section of clean straw and looked at the underside of the barn roof, where the last of the day's light was going gray in the gaps between the planks. She thought about the man at the door, not with fear, or not with the fear she had expected to feel, but with a kind of puzzled attention she could not quite put away. She had been told things about what that encounter would be like, and the telling had been specific and assured, delivered by people in positions of authority in tones that did not invite question. And the reality of it had been simply that a tired soldier stood in a doorway and did his job. She could not make those two things occupy the same space in her mind comfortably. One of them had to be wrong, and the structure of everything she had been taught told her that her observation was the less reliable of the two. Propaganda is most effective not when it creates false beliefs from nothing, but when it trains people to distrust the evidence of their own senses. Ilsa did not know this as a principle. She only knew that she felt confused, and that the confusion was uncomfortable, and that the comfortable thing would be to set it aside. She set it aside and went to sleep. The truck that carried them east the following morning was a standard American military transport, canvas-covered, with wooden bench seating along both sides of the bed. They shared it with 8 other women picked up from a different location, women they did not know, and the ride lasted several hours over roads that were in varying states of repair. Through the gap in the canvas at the back, Ilsa watched the Bavarian countryside pass. Rolling hills still green with spring, farmhouses with red tile roofs, a river valley that caught the morning light at an angle that made it look almost peaceful, which it was, in a technical sense. The war had not come to this particular valley in any visible way. The farm stood intact. The fields would be planted late this season, perhaps, but the soil was there, and the buildings were there, and the stone walls that divided the properties from one another had been standing for centuries, and would continue to stand. She had grown up in a country that told its people the Allies were starving, that their war effort was failing, that their cities were broken and their populations desperate. What she could see through the gap in the canvas did not confirm or deny this entirely. This was Germany, after all, and the fact that certain Bavarian valleys remained undamaged said nothing definitive about Birmingham or Detroit or Philadelphia. But the soldiers in this truck did not look like men from a nation in collapse. Their equipment worked. Their vehicles ran. They were adequately fed, clearly, in the way that adequately fed people carry themselves differently from people who are not. She noted this the same way Kathy noted things, without drawing immediate conclusions, simply filing the observation somewhere it could be returned to later. The facility they arrived at in the early afternoon had been a Wehrmacht barracks before the Americans took it, and the conversion had been practical rather than thorough. The same long buildings, the same arrangement of structures around a central yard, the same functional ugliness of military architecture, but with American administrative systems layered over the German ones. New signs, American flags, guard rotations following American protocols. A compound within the larger facility had been set aside for female prisoners, separated from the male compound by a double fence with a guarded gate between them. The women were processed again at a second intake desk, more thoroughly this time. Photographs, a medical screening, questions about pre-existing conditions, injuries, illnesses. The medical screening was conducted in a converted room off the main administrative building, and it was performed by an American Army nurse, a woman in her 30s with dark hair pinned efficiently under her cap, in a manner that was competent and entirely without sentiment. She worked through the line of women with the same speed and thoroughness as the German nurses Kathy had trained alongside years ago, and when she found that Kathy had a shoulder injury, she spent additional time examining the range of motion and asking questions through an interpreter about the original wound and the treatment it had received. Her interest was clinical. Her hands were careful. Kathy answered her questions precisely and watched the nurse work with the involuntary professional attention of one medical person evaluating another. The examination was good, technically sound, methodical, attentive to details that a less trained eye would miss. When it was over, the nurse wrote something in a chart and told the interpreter to tell Kathy that the infirmary had a physician who could examine the shoulder more thoroughly if she wanted, that there was no obligation, but the offer stood. Kathy said she would consider it. What she was actually doing was recalibrating, filing another observation in the growing collection of things that did not match what she had been led to expect. An adequate medical examination, an infirmary with a physician, an offer, not a requirement. She kept her expression neutral, because neutrality was her habit, but the filing was happening. The barracks room they were assigned held 16 women, 8 bunks along each wall, each with a straw mattress and 2 blankets, and a small shelf at the head. The room smelled of pine cleaner and the particular mineral smell of old stone buildings in spring. A window at each end provided cross-ventilation, and through one of them Ilsa could see a section of the inner yard, where a group of prisoners from an earlier intake were sitting in the afternoon sun, talking in small clusters, looking for all the world like women waiting for something rather than women in captivity. It was not what she had imagined. She sat on the edge of her bunk and acknowledged this to herself quietly, without elaboration. She did not know yet what the days ahead would bring, what the physician in the infirmary would turn out to be, what small or large event was working its way toward the surface of this story. She only knew that the distance between what she had expected and what she was experiencing had not closed. It had, if anything, grown slightly wider with every hour. Hilda sat on the bunk across from her and pulled her blanket around her shoulders even though the room was not cold. Outside, in the yard, a woman laughed at something another woman had said. The sound traveled through the open window without distortion, clear and ordinary, and it was strange to hear laughter in a place like this. Strange enough that Ilsa looked up at the sound, and then looked at Hilda, who had also looked up, and for a moment the two of them simply sat in the fading afternoon light, and held the strangeness of it together without speaking. The first full day in the compound passed in the way that first days in unfamiliar places often pass, slowly in some parts, quickly in others, with a general quality of unreality that came not from anything dramatic happening, but from the ordinary rhythms of life asserting themselves in surroundings that the mind had not yet accepted as real. There was a morning roll call at 7, conducted in the outer yard by our American sergeant who moved through the count with professional efficiency, and then breakfast in the mess building, and then a period of unstructured time that the women were free to spend in the yard or in their rooms, and then a midday meal, and then more time, and then dinner, and then lights at 9. The structure was not oppressive. It was simply structure, the skeleton of a day, and Ilsa found that she moved through it in a state of suspended attention, observing everything and committing to nothing. The mess hall was a large room with long wooden tables and benches, and the food was served from metal containers set on a counter at one end. On that first morning there was porridge, thick and plain, and bread that was a day old but not stale, and a tin cup of coffee that was real coffee, not the ersatz grain coffee that had been standard in Germany for the last 2 years. Ilsa held the cup between both hands and breathed the steam before drinking, and the smell was so simply and completely the smell of coffee that she felt something move through her chest that was close to grief, though she could not have explained immediately why. It was the smell of before. Of Saturday mornings in Munich when her father was still alive and the shop was closed, and the house smelled of coffee and clock oil, and there was no particular reason for the day to be anything other than itself. She drank the coffee and said nothing. Kathy sat beside her and ate her porridge and observed the room with the quiet thoroughness that had become Ilsa's primary way of understanding her. The mess hall was staffed by 2 American soldiers who served the food and 2 more who stood near the entrance, and among the 4 of them was the same racial mixture that Ilsa had been encountering since the road outside Regensburg. White and black soldiers working alongside each other without visible hierarchy based on anything other than rank, addressing each other with the casual ease of men who had been working together long enough that the arrangement required no commentary. One of the servers, a young black private with a wide, calm face, handed Ilsa her bread with a brief nod that meant nothing more or less than "Here is your bread," and she took it with a murmured "Danke" that he likely did not understand, and that she produced purely from habit. Hilda, sitting across the table, had been watching the servers with an expression that Ilsa was beginning to learn how to read. That particular combination of held breath and widened attention that meant Hilda was observing something that was in the process of failing to match her expectations. They just worked together, Hilda said quietly, not really to anyone. More the way a person speaks when a thought becomes too large to stay internal. And Kathy looked up from her porridge and said that yes, they did, and returned to eating, and that was the end of that conversation. But Ilsa understood that the observation was not trivial. It was in fact the same observation she had been making since the previous morning, phrased with Hilda's characteristic directness. They just worked together, as though it were the most unremarkable thing in the world. As though the entire elaborate architecture of racial doctrine that the German state had spent a decade constructing and enforcing and teaching in schoolrooms to children who had no other framework were simply absent, not defeated, not contested, simply not present as an organizing principle of how these men moved through their day. Marta had said almost nothing at breakfast. She ate methodically and looked at the table and occasionally at the window, through which a section of the compound fence was visible against the morning sky. She was not disengaged. Ilsa had learned that Marta's silence was not the silence of withdrawal, but of deep internal processing, of a person who kept her most significant observations so close to her chest that they became visible only in small gestures, in the angle of her head, in the way she sometimes paused with a spoon halfway to her mouth as though a thought had interrupted the movement. She did this once during breakfast, the spoon suspended, her eyes on the middle distance. And then she completed the motion and continued eating, and Ilsa thought about asking her what she had been thinking and then decided not to. After breakfast came the yard, and the yard in the morning light was a different thing from what it had been the previous afternoon. The night's cold had lifted and the spring sun was high enough to carry actual warmth. And the women who had been in the compound longer, some of them for 2 or 3 weeks already, were making use of this with the competence of people who had found the small available comforts and organized their days around them. A group near the south wall had found a patch of direct sunlight and arranged themselves to take advantage of it, sitting with their faces turned upward in the manner of people who had not had enough warmth for a long time and were not going to waste any that was offered. 2 women were walking the perimeter of the yard in slow circuits, talking. Another group had formed near the building that, according to a hand-lettered sign Ilsa could not yet fully read, appeared to be some kind of activities or recreation space. It was Kathy who first mentioned the infirmary directly. They were standing near the center of the yard when she said, without preamble, that she was going to take the nurse up on the offer of a thorough examination for her shoulder, that it had been bothering her in the night, and that she had questions about the scar tissue that she had not had the opportunity to ask someone qualified since leaving the field hospital. "Come with me if you want," she said to Ilse, not as a request exactly, more as an extension of information, and Ilse said that she would, partly because she had nothing else to do and partly because she was curious about the infirmary in the way she had become curious about everything here, with a watchful and slightly reluctant attention, as though each new room she entered might contain another piece of evidence she was not yet sure how to incorporate. The infirmary was in a long, low building at the northern edge of the compound, identifiable by the red cross painted on the roof that Kathy had noticed on arrival. Inside, it was clean in the specific and rigorous way that medical spaces are clean, antiseptic smell cutting through the underlying stone and wood, white cloth partitions between cots, metal equipment laid out on a trolley with the precise spacing of tools that are used regularly and returned to exactly the same place. Two women from an earlier intake were sitting on cots along the far wall, one reading, one simply resting, and an American nurse, a different one from the previous day, younger, with red hair, was writing at a desk near the entrance. She looked up when they came in and said something in English that a young German-speaking orderly translated as the doctor would be with them shortly. Please sit wherever was comfortable. They sat on two cots near the window and waited. The room had the quality of quiet that comes with enforced rest, the quality Ilse associated with the waiting rooms of small-town physicians in peacetime, a suspended, gentle tedium. Through the window, she could see a corner of the outer yard and a section of road beyond the compound fence, and a single American truck moving along that road at a pace unhurried enough to suggest that there was no particular emergency anywhere in its immediate vicinity. She watched it until it passed out of sight. She heard the doctor before she saw him. His footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, moving along a corridor to the left of the main room, and then he came through the door at the corridor's end, reading from a chart as he walked. He was a tall man, lean, wearing a white coat over his uniform, a stethoscope hanging from his neck. His hair was cropped close. His hands, which held the chart with the particular grip of someone accustomed to managing papers, files, and instruments simultaneously, were the hands of a surgeon, long-fingered, careful, the knuckles sharp. He was, without question, black. Ilse felt Kathy go still beside her, not with fear, but with the kind of total attention that precedes a decision. She felt her own stillness in response, and she was aware of it, aware that she had gone still in a way that was a reaction rather than a choice, a bodily response to the gap between expectation and reality that her mind had not yet bridged. The doctor finished reading the chart, looked up, and saw them. He nodded in the brief professional way of a person whose schedule is full and whose attention is on the task rather than the introduction. "Kathy Richter," he said, pronouncing the name with reasonable accuracy, glancing at the chart, and then he said something in English that the orderly translated as he understood she had a shoulder injury from field service and he would like to examine it properly. Kathy stood and followed him to the examination area behind one of the white partitions, and Ilse remained on her cot and looked at the window and tried to organize herself. She thought about what the propaganda had said. She tried to recall the specific language, the specific images, and found that they were difficult to hold clearly in her mind now that they had to exist alongside what her eyes were actually providing, which was a physician in a clean white coat with a stethoscope and a patient's chart, conducting a medical examination with what she could hear, through the partition, as the careful, specific, methodical language of someone who knew what they were doing. She could hear his voice and Kathy's voice and the orderly's translation working between them, and what she heard was the vocabulary of medicine, range of motion, nerve response, adhesion, scar tissue, compression, inflammation, delivered with the same flat precision that Kathy herself used when speaking professionally. And she heard Kathy respond to his questions in full and accurate answers, which meant that whatever Kathy had expected to find behind that partition, what she was actually finding was competent enough to engage with seriously. The examination took nearly 20 minutes. When it was over, Kathy came back around the partition and sat down on the cot with her coat half rebuttoned, and the doctor came behind her and spoke to the orderly at some length while writing in the chart. And the orderly told Kathy that the doctor had found significant scar tissue adhesion along the posterior deltoid, that there were targeted exercises that would improve the range of motion over time, that he would write out a regimen for her, and that if she experienced any increase in pain during the exercises, she should return. He tore a page from a small notepad and handed it to Kathy with a brief direct look and said something that the orderly translated as, "This will help if you do it consistently." And Kathy took the paper and looked at what was written on it, and then looked at him. And what happened in that brief exchange of glances was something Ilsa could not fully name except to say that it was the look of one professional acknowledging another. The doctor returned to the corridor. The red-haired nurse came to check on the two resting women along the far wall. The orderly went back to a desk near the entrance and resumed whatever task had been interrupted. The room returned to its suspended quiet. Kathy sat with the notepad page in her hands and looked at it for a moment longer than necessary for reading it. And then she folded it carefully and placed it in the breast pocket of her coat. And the gesture had a deliberateness to it that made Ilsa think it was not just a piece of paper being stored, but something else being acknowledged. Some small and significant accounting being made between what had been expected and what had in fact occurred. "Well," Kathy said, which was more than she usually said, and then she said nothing else, and Ilsa did not ask her to elaborate, because she thought she understood. Outside, the morning was continuing. The truck had long since passed. The sun had moved a fraction along its arc, and the light through the window had shifted accordingly, warming the stone floor near the wall in a stripe that widened very slowly as the morning progressed. Ilsa looked at it and thought about what she had heard through the partition, the vocabulary, the precision, the 20 careful minutes given to the shoulder of a German prisoner of war by a man the regime she had served would have classified as something other than a physician, other than a professional, other than someone whose knowledge and skill could be trusted with a human body. She thought about the chart he had been reading when he walked in, the way he had held it, the stethoscope, the notepad. She could not make any of this fit into the story she had been given about the world, and she was too honest, sitting in that quiet room with the sunlight moving across the stone floor, to pretend that she had not noticed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was, if not comfortable, at least legible. The compound had its own internal logic, a set of routines and patterns that became familiar quickly in the way that any repeated sequence becomes familiar, not through understanding but through repetition, through the body learning to anticipate the next event before the mind has consciously registered it. The 7 o'clock whistle. The walk to the mess hall in the cool morning air. The particular smell of the compound at different hours, which changed from the damp stone and pine cleaner of early morning to the warmer, dustier smell of midday sun on gravel, and then to something thinner and colder in the evenings when the temperature dropped and the yard emptied and the lights in the barracks windows became the primary source of illumination. Ilsa came to know these things not as observations, but as the texture of her days, and there was something both reassuring and deeply strange about becoming accustomed to a place she had not chosen. Among the women in their barracks room, distinctions of personality had begun to emerge with greater clarity as the initial shock of arrival receded. There was a woman from Würzburg named Frida who spoke in long, confident sentences about how temporary all of this was and how quickly Germany would rebuild, and whose confidence seemed to require a great deal of maintenance, as though she were a furnace that needed constant stoking to stay at temperature. There was a woman from Cologne named Bridget who had stopped speaking almost entirely after the first day, and who spent most of her time sitting on her bunk with her hands folded in her lap, not reading, not sleeping, simply waiting in the way that certain people wait when they have decided that waiting is the only thing left to do. There were others who fell between these points on the spectrum, who had found small things to occupy themselves, mending clothes, writing letters, walking the yard in the morning in groups of 2 or 3, and who moved through each day with the quiet pragmatism of people who understood that endurance was a practical matter rather than an emotional one. Marta was among these. She had, within the first 3 days, made herself useful in the mess hall kitchen, which was staffed during preparation hours by prisoners who volunteered for the work, supervised by an American cook named Henderson, who communicated primarily through gesture and whose patience with linguistic misunderstanding was so complete and so good-humored that he managed to run an efficient kitchen across an almost total language barrier. Marta had walked into the kitchen on the second morning and simply begun working, and Henderson had watched her for a few minutes and then moved her to the station where she was most useful and left her there, and that had been the arrangement since. The kitchen was hot and the work was physical, and it required enough concentration to fill the hours without leaving space for much else. And Ilse suspected that this was precisely what Marta needed. Ilse herself had taken to spending a portion of the morning in the area near the recreation building, which contained, among other things, a shelf of books. Most were in English, which she could not read well enough for sustained comprehension, but there were several German volumes, a collection of Goethe, a Schiller she had read twice before, a novel she did not recognize, and she had been working through the Schiller with the concentration of someone using a familiar text as an anchor, a way of locating herself in the world through language when the world itself had become difficult to locate. She read slowly and did not always track the meaning. The words were enough. It was during one of these mornings, about a week into their stay, that she first observed the doctor at work outside the infirmary. He came into the yard in the mid-morning, not in his white coat now, but in his uniform, and he was not alone. The red-haired nurse was with him, and they were moving with purpose toward the eastern end of the compound, where a woman from a different barracks had apparently collapsed near the fence. Ilse had not seen the collapse itself. She had looked up from her book at the sound of raised voices and had registered the small cluster forming near the fence and had watched the doctor and the nurse cross the yard toward it. He was moving quickly, not running, but with the lengthened stride of someone for whom urgency and composure were not in conflict. He had a leather bag in his right hand that he had apparently collected from the infirmary before coming out, and he opened it before he reached the cluster of women, taking something from it. She could not see what, as he walked, so that by the time he knelt beside the woman on the ground, he already had what he needed in his hands. Ilse set down her book and watched. From her distance, she could see the general shape of the scene. The woman on the ground, the cluster of women around her, the doctor and the nurse working, the two guards who had come quickly to the edge of the cluster and then held back, understanding that their function in this particular situation was to keep a perimeter rather than to intervene. She could not hear what was being said. She could see movement, the nurse taking something from the bag, the doctor's hands doing something near the woman's neck, and then her arm, the careful and practiced movements of people who knew exactly what each movement was for. Several of the women in the cluster were speaking, gesturing, explaining something, and the orderly who had come with the doctor was translating in rapid fragments, and the doctor was listening while working, in the way that skilled medical people listen, with a portion of their attention that runs alongside the portion directing the hands. The woman on the ground was conscious. Ilse could see this from the occasional small movement, a shift of position, a gesture toward the doctor. Whatever had happened, it was not immediately fatal. The doctor was sitting back on his heels now, still talking through the orderly, his hands on his knees, his bearing carrying the particular relaxation of someone who has passed through the acute phase of an emergency and is now in the management phase. The nurse was writing something. The doctor stood and said something to the orderly, who turned to the cluster of women and said something that caused them to disperse slightly, giving the woman on the ground more air, and then two of the guards helped carry the woman, carefully, horizontally, the way people carry someone who should not be walking, toward the infirmary. The whole episode lasted perhaps 15 minutes. When it was over, the yard returned to its morning state, and Ilse picked up her book and looked at the page she had been reading and found that she could not locate her place or remember what she had been following in the text. She set the book down again and looked at the space near the fence where the cluster had been, which was empty now, the morning light falling on the gravel exactly as it had before. There was a small smudge on the fence post near where the woman had been lying, dust or mud, and a single dark button from someone's coat on the ground that had come loose in the commotion and been left behind. These were the only evidence that anything had happened. Ilse looked at the button for a moment and then looked at the infirmary building, where the red cross on the roof was catching the late morning sun, and then she picked up her Schiller and tried again to find her page. That afternoon, Hilda came to find her with news from the kitchen, delivered in the manner of someone who has been carrying information for several hours and has reached the limit of their capacity to carry it alone. Hilda sat down on the bench beside Ilse and spoke quietly and without preamble. explaining that Marta had told her what she had seen from the kitchen window during the morning incident, that the woman who had collapsed was named Renata, that she was 30 years old and from Augsburg and had been in the compound for 12 days already, that she had been sick for several of those days with something that had begun as a cold and progressed into something the infirmary had been monitoring. The collapse was not unexpected to the medical staff, apparently. They had seen it coming in the way that medical people see things coming when they have access to information that patients and observers do not. What Marta had noticed from the kitchen, and what she had told Hilda with the quiet specificity of someone reporting an observation rather than a feeling, was the manner in which the doctor had spoken to Renata after the immediate crisis had passed. Not the words. Marta did not have the English for the words, but the manner, the specific quality of attention, the way he had stayed at her level rather than standing over her, the way his voice had carried even across the yard with a steadiness that communicated something Marta had described simply as he spoke to her like a person. Ilse thought about this for a while. She thought about the phrase itself, spoke to her like a person, and the fact that Marta, who had survived Dresden and the loss of everything that event implied, and who had a precision of language that came from long practice in communicating exactly what was meant and nothing more, had chosen those particular words. Not kindly or professionally or adequately, but like a person. As though that were the relevant category. As though it were the category most in need of noting. In the days that followed, Renata remained in the infirmary, and the doctor's visits to the compound became a recurring feature of Ilse's observation in the way that anything repeated in a small space becomes impossible to ignore. He came twice daily, once in the morning as part of what appeared to be a general infirmary round, and once in the late afternoon for a shorter visit that she came to associate with check-ins on patients he was monitoring. He moved through the compound with the same composed efficiency she had noted from the beginning, acknowledging guards and women with the same brief nod, carrying his bag when he came from the infirmary, and sometimes without it when he came from the administrative building, always reading something or writing something in transit. Always using the time between points as though he had long since decided that unused minutes were a resource he could not afford to waste. She began to learn small things about him from observation and from the fragments of information that circulated through the compound in the informal exchange of details that constitutes the social life of any enclosed community. His name was Captain William Jarvis. He was from Philadelphia. He had been a practicing physician for 6 years before the war, internal medicine, with additional training in infectious disease that made him particularly valuable in the field hospital context. He spoke no German, which was why the orderly was always near, but he had apparently learned enough individual words and phrases to manage the most basic direct communications, and the women who had spent time in the infirmary reported that he used these fragments judiciously, not as performance, but as courtesy, as a small gesture toward the space between languages that cost him something to attempt, and that he attempted anyway. What reached Ilse about him most persistently was not any single observation, but the accumulation of them. The way each small piece of information added to the picture without resolving it into anything simple or neat. She had been given a story about what a black man was and what he was capable of, and the story had been specific and consistent and had come from sources she had been trained to trust. And now she had this other account being assembled in real time from her own observation, and the two accounts were irreconcilable in a way that she could not indefinitely defer addressing. She deferred it anyway, because she had not yet found the terms on which to conduct the reckoning, and because the deferral was easier than the alternative. Renata improved slowly over the following days, and word of her improvement moved through the compound in small increments. She had sat up, she had eaten something, she was expected to return to the barracks within the week. These updates were carried primarily by the women who had been assigned to kitchen or cleaning duties near the infirmary, who had better access to the orderly and to the nurses, and they were received with the disproportionate attention that small pieces of good news receive in enclosed places, where the emotional weather of the group is sensitive to any shift in the prevailing conditions. It was during this period, on an afternoon in early May when the light was lasting longer and the yard was warm enough that women were sitting outside after the evening meal rather than retreating immediately to the barracks, that Ilse found herself in conversation with a woman named Lotte, who had been in the compound for 3 weeks and who had a directness about her that came, Ilse suspected, from the particular freedom of someone who had already revised her assumptions several times and had, stopped being embarrassed about the revision. Latte was from Hamburg, 41 years old, with a schoolteacher's habit of making her points clearly and without decoration. She had been talking about the compound generally, about the routines, the food, the guards, all of it delivered with a calm appraisal that Ilse found unexpectedly comfortable to listen to. And then she said that she wanted to tell Ilse something about Dr. Jarvis that she thought Ilse should know. Latte said it without drama, looking at the yard rather than at Ilse, which made it easier to hear. She had been in the infirmary 2 weeks ago with a chest infection that had come on quickly and badly. Bad enough that for 2 days, she had not been certain which direction things were moving in. And Jarvis had come in on the second night, not during scheduled rounds, but at 2 in the morning, called by the night nurse who had been concerned about the change in Latte's breathing. Latte had been conscious enough to be aware of his arrival, and what she remembered most clearly, she said, pressing her hands together in her lap, was that he had sat down on the chair beside her cot and stayed for nearly an hour, monitoring, adjusting, keeping watch, and that at some point in that hour she had asked him through the orderly, who had apparently also been called in at 2 in the morning, a fact that registered its own particular significance, whether she was going to be all right. And he had looked at her directly and said that he was going to do his best, and that his best was considerable, and that the manner in which he said it was not a boast or a comfort offered to silence a question, but simply an accurate statement of fact, delivered with the same composure he brought to everything else, and that she had believed him, and that in believing him she had experienced the first genuine sense of safety she had felt in a very long time. She said all of this looking at the yard, and when she finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she had thought about what to make of it for 2 weeks, and had not arrived at a single clean conclusion, and that she supposed Ilse might find it useful to know. Ilse sat with this and found that she had nothing immediate to say, no response that felt proportionate, because what Latte had described was not an argument or a contradiction or even an evidence. It was something simpler and more difficult, which was a person doing her best to tell the truth about what had happened to her in a room at 2 in the morning when the question of which side anyone was on had been entirely beside the point. The evening light was long and golden over the compound fence. Somewhere in the yard a woman was humming something low and half-formed. The sound carried without words across the gravel and the still air, and Ilse sat and listened to it, and thought about 2 in the morning and an hour of careful watching and a man who had been awake when he did not have to be, attending to a woman who belonged, in the official ledger of the world they all still technically inhabited, to the other side. Renata returned to the barracks on a Thursday morning, walking slowly but without assistance, carrying the thin blanket from her infirmary cot folded over one arm, because she had apparently become attached to it in the way that people become attached to objects that were present during difficult periods, not for any quality the object possesses, but for what it witnessed. She was thinner than she had been, which for a woman who had already been thin from months of inadequate wartime rations meant that the angles of her face were more pronounced, the hollows under her eyes deeper, her hands when she set the blanket down on her bunk looking like the hands of someone older than her 30 years. But she was upright and she was present, and she looked around the barracks room with the slightly dazed gratitude of a person returning to ordinary life from somewhere that had briefly threatened to become permanent. The women in the room received her with the quiet warmth of a small community that had been tracking her progress from a distance and was now able to close the distance. Someone had saved her a portion of the morning bread. Someone else had straightened her bunk in the days she had been away, had kept the shelf clear and the blanket folded, a gesture so small as to be almost invisible and so considered as to mean a great deal. Renata sat on the edge of her bunk and ate the bread and looked at these things and said thank you in the way people say thank you when they mean something considerably larger than the words themselves contain. Ilse watched this from across the room and thought about Latte's account of the night at 2 in the morning, which had stayed with her in the days since the conversation with an insistence that she could not entirely account for. It was not that the account was dramatic. It was, in fact, notable for the absence of drama, for its specificity and its restraint. It was that the account was credible. Not because Latte was a particularly convincing speaker, though she was, but because the details she had offered were not the details a person invents when constructing a story to make a point. They were the details a person notices when they are lying in an infirmary cot at 2 in the morning trying to determine whether they are going to survive, which is to say they were the details of reality rather than of argument, and reality had a texture that argument could not replicate. Ilsa had spent enough of her life reading closely enough to understand the difference. What she was less certain about was what the account required of her in return. Recognition, perhaps. Acknowledgement that the category she had placed this man in, the category constructed for her over years by a system that needed those categories to maintain itself, was inadequate to contain the actual person. This recognition did not arrive with any particular ceremony. It arrived in the manner of most genuine reckonings, which is quietly and inconveniently, without providing any immediate relief or resolution, simply depositing itself into the ongoing account of things she now knew and could not unknow. She was a woman who had spent the last several years surrounded by certainty, by a culture that had organized itself entirely around certainty, around the conviction that the categories it had constructed were real and fixed and required no further examination. The experience of uncertainty, of genuinely not knowing how to classify what she was observing, was in some ways more disorienting than anything else the compound had produced. Kathy, for her part, had begun doing the shoulder exercises from Jarvis's notepad page with the discipline of a former medical professional who understands that recovery protocols work only if followed precisely and consistently. She did them each morning before breakfast, standing near the window in the early light with her coat off despite the chill, moving her arm through the prescribed range with a concentration that admitted nothing extraneous. Ilsa had watched her do this for several mornings without comment, and then one morning Kathy, without looking away from the window, had said that the adhesion was loosening, that she had regained approximately 15 degrees of range in the posterior rotation, and that the protocol was correctly designed for the specific injury pattern. She said this the way she said most things, without apparent emotional investment, as a report rather than a reflection, and Ilsa had said that was good, and Kathy had agreed that it was, and that had been the end of the exchange, but what it contained, Ilsa thought, was something that Kathy was unlikely to say in plainer language, which was that she had been examined competently and treated correctly, and that the person who had done these things had known what he was doing in exactly the way that mattered, which was technically and thoroughly. The days were growing longer now, and the light was lasting past 7 in the evening, which changed the quality of the late afternoon in the compound in a way that was difficult to name, but clearly felt. There was more time in the yard after dinner, more time for the informal gatherings that had become the primary social structure of the compound. Small clusters of women sitting on the wooden benches along the yard walls, or walking the slow circuits of the perimeter that had become a kind of moving conversation, a way of talking while in motion that preserved the option to disengage without the awkwardness of leaving a seated group. Ilsa had come to appreciate these circuits. She had walked them with Kathy, with Hilda, with Lotte twice more since the evening of the infirmary account, and on one occasion with Marta, who had spoken during that walk more than she had spoken in the entire previous week, not about Dresden or her husband or the war specifically, but about the kitchen, about Henderson's cooking, about a recipe he had attempted one afternoon with obvious enthusiasm and questionable results that had caused the kitchen women to exchange looks over his shoulder with the diplomatic restraint of people who understand that criticism requires a shared language they do not yet have. It was one of these evenings, the light long and warm and the air carrying the first actual warmth of the year, that Ilsa encountered Jarvis outside the infirmary in a context that was not clinical. He was sitting on the low stone step outside the infirmary's side entrance, his white coat off, his uniform jacket unbuttoned at the collar, a metal cup of coffee in his hand, looking at the middle distance with the slightly unfocused expression of a person who has been working since early morning and has finally found 15 minutes that belong to no particular task. He had a small notebook open on his knee, not a medical chart, but something smaller and more personal, and he was writing in it in a loose, unhurried hand that was entirely different from the compressed professional script she had seen him use in the infirmary. He did not see her immediately, because she had come around the corner of the building from an angle that was outside his field of vision, and by the time he looked up, she was already close enough that stopping would have been more conspicuous than continuing. He nodded, the same brief professional nod she recognized. She nodded in return. She would have kept walking except that the orderly was sitting on the step beside him. She had not noticed the orderly at first, and the orderly said something to Jarvis in English, and Jarvis looked at her again with an expression that was attentive without being demanding, and the orderly said, in German, that the doctor wanted to know how she was finding the compound, whether there was anything she needed from the medical side. It was a routine question, clearly, the kind of thing he asked because he was a physician in a facility full of people whose health was his responsibility, and it required only a routine answer, and she gave him one. That she was well, that she had no medical concerns, that she was grateful for the care given to her colleague with the shoulder injury. The orderly translated this, and Jarvis listened, and then said something that the orderly rendered as he was glad the shoulder was improving, that it was a manageable condition with consistent attention, and that she should have her colleague come back in 2 weeks for a follow-up. That would have been the end of it. A brief and practical exchange entirely in keeping with the professional register he maintained in all his compound interactions. But then something small happened that was not practical and not professional and not in keeping with any register she had been prepared for. He looked down at the notebook on his knee, and then he looked back at her, and said something short that the orderly translated simply as he is sorry about the war, about what it has cost people on both sides, and that he hopes the coming months are easier than the ones behind. Then he picked up his coffee and returned his attention to the notebook, and the conversation was over as cleanly as it had begun. Ilse walked away from that step with the careful pace of someone who is preventing themselves from walking too quickly, and she went to the far end of the yard and stood near the fence and looked at the road beyond it for a long time. The road was empty. The evening light was falling at a low angle across the fields on the other side and making the new grass look almost luminous, that particular green of spring in Bavaria that she had known her entire life, and that looked different now in a way she could not entirely attribute to the quality of the light. She thought about what he had said. Not the specific words, those were simple enough, but the fact of saying them, the choice to say them, the understanding that would have been required to arrive at the decision that this was something worth saying to a woman standing outside a building in a prisoner of war compound in Bavaria in May of 1945. He had nothing to gain from saying it. This was the thought that returned to her most insistently over the following hours, because she was aware that one of the defenses she had maintained against the evidence accumulating around her was the argument that American treatment of prisoners was a strategy, a performance designed to produce docile captives and favorable reports to the Red Cross, that the kindness and the food and the medical care were investments rather than gestures. It was a coherent argument, and she had found it useful. But a man sitting on a stone step with his jacket unbuttoned and a personal notebook on his knee, saying to a stranger that he was sorry about what the war had cost, was not performing for any audience. The orderly was there, but the orderly was not an audience in any meaningful sense. There was no one to impress, no report to effect, no calculus of prisoner management that required this particular exchange. It was simply a person saying something true to another person and then returning to his coffee and his notebook, because that was apparently the kind of person he was. She stood at the fence until the light went flat and the fields across the road lost their luminosity and became simply fields in the early evening, ordinary and particular and thoroughly themselves. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the compound settling into its nighttime state, voices diminishing, the creak of baroque doors, the footsteps of the guard rotation moving along the perimeter. She thought about her father's shop in Munich, the smell of it, the glass case of mechanisms, the quality of attention he had brought to small and intricate things. He had been a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and she had valued this in him without fully understanding what it meant to value it until she was older, until she had lived long enough to encounter the alternative. She thought about the years of official language she had moved through, the language that said one thing and meant another, that named things incorrectly so consistently that the incorrect names had come to seem correct, that had built an entire description of the world on the premise that certain categories of people were less than what they were. And she thought about a physician from Philadelphia sitting on a stone step with a notebook and saying, "I am sorry about the war," said simply and without expectation of anything in return, offered into the space between them as the only honest thing available in a moment that could have contained nothing at all. She walked back to the barracks slowly, in the last of the light. Marta was already on her bunk, reading something from the shelf in the recreation room. Kathy was at the window, doing the last of her evening shoulder exercises with the same focused economy she brought to everything. Hilda was asleep, or close to it, her breathing slow and her face carrying in sleep the particular openness that worry usually obscured. Ilsa sat on her bunk and unlaced her boots and set them side by side under the shelf and lay back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the compound going quiet around her. She did not try to organize what she was feeling into conclusions. She only lay with it, the way you lie with something that is too large and too newly arrived to be put into the correct order yet, and let the darkness come in around the edges of the window, and let the sounds of the night outside the fence be what they were, which was ordinary, which was the sound of a world that continued regardless of what any particular person had believed about it, a world that had always been more complicated and more various than the story told about it, and that was only now, in the specific and irreversible way of direct experience, beginning to make itself known to her in its actual dimensions. The morning Renata was well enough to walk the yard circuits was a Monday, 12 days after her return to the barracks, and there was nothing ceremonial about it. She simply appeared after breakfast in the yard with her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and began walking, slowly, with the deliberate pace of someone relearning a thing the body has temporarily forgotten. Ilsa fell into step beside her without being asked, because the yard circuits had become her own habit, and because Renata's pace matched the pace she had settled into herself, that particular speed that is not quite slow enough to seem purposeless, but not fast enough to preclude attention to things on either side. They walked without speaking for the first circuit, which suited them both, and the morning air was cool enough to see their breath, and the gravel was still damp from overnight rain, and the guard in the nearest tower was reading something, his rifle leaning against the rail beside him with the posture of a tool set down between uses. On the second circuit, Renata said, without preamble, that she wanted to tell Ilsa something about the infirmary, about the nights she had spent there, and Ilsa said that she was listening. Renata spoke slowly, choosing her words with the care of someone who has rehearsed a thing internally many times, and is now discovering that the rehearsed version and the spoken version are different in ways that require adjustment. She said that there had been a night, the third night, when the fever had been at its worst, when she had been conscious enough to know what was happening to her, but not conscious enough to manage the fear that came with that knowledge, and that Jarvis had come in and had sat beside the cot, and had spoken to her through the orderly in a voice that was low and steady, and that did not contain any of the specific reassurances she had been expecting. None of the "it will be fine" or "you will recover" that people say in those situations because they cannot think of what else to say. What he had said instead was a series of precise and accurate statements about what her body was doing and what the treatment was addressing and what the likely progression of the following hours would be. And he had said these things not because he thought clinical information was what she needed emotionally, but because he understood, she thought, that what she actually needed was to be treated as someone capable of receiving accurate information, as someone whose intelligence and dignity were not suspended by the fact of being ill and frightened in an enemy facility in a foreign country. He had talked to her, she said, the way you talk to someone you respect. Ilsa listened to this and walked and said nothing for a while, and then she said that she believed her, that it was consistent with what she had observed, and Renata nodded, and they continued walking. The sun had come through the clouds by this point, and the wet gravel was beginning to dry in patches, the lighter patches spreading slowly as the morning warmed. Around them the yard was filling with the mid-morning activity of women who had finished their assigned work for the first half of the day, some sitting against the south wall in the sun, some in small groups talking. One woman near the recreation building attempting to teach another woman a card game and meeting with what appeared to be patient resistance. Ordinary life, or the closest approximation to it that the compound structure permitted. Ilsa looked at all of it and thought that this was something she would not have been able to name 2 weeks ago, and could name now, which was that ordinary life was not a thing that belonged to one side of a fence or one side of a war, that it asserted itself in enclosed spaces and strange places with the same persistence it showed everywhere else, and that the women sitting in the sun against the south wall were not performing normalcy as a defense against their situation, but were simply, factually, normal, human beings spending a morning in a yard in the way that human beings spend mornings when the acute emergency has passed, and the longer, slower work of continuing has begun. She thought about Hilda, who had been frightened of these soldiers specifically, frightened with the particular vividness of someone whose fear had been constructed from images and language rather than from experience, and who had spent the past 2 weeks quietly and incrementally replacing those images with other ones. With the private who handed her bread without looking at her, with the corporal who had helped a woman carry a heavy crate without being asked, with the accumulated minor evidence of men doing a job and doing it without cruelty, without the specific dangers that the propaganda had promised were inherent and inevitable. Hilda had not articulated any of this as a revision or a conclusion. She would not, probably. She was not constitutionally a person who summarized her own changes of mind. But the fear had changed its quality, had lost the particular edge of anticipatory dread, and become something more like ordinary uncertainty, the uncertainty of someone in an unfamiliar situation rather than someone in a specifically threatened one. Ilse had noticed this the way she noticed most things, gradually and without announcement, filing it alongside everything else. She thought about Kathy, whose shoulder exercises had become a kind of daily testimony, performed each morning with the same consistency and precision that she brought to everything she valued, which meant that the notepad page from Jarvis's examination had been placed in the category of things Kathy valued, a category that was not large and that did not admit objects of questionable quality. Kathy had said very little about any of this and would continue to say very little, but the doing was its own kind of statement, the 15 degrees of recovered range of motion its own kind of evidence, and Ilse had learned to read Kathy in the currency she actually dealt in, which was action rather than declaration. She thought about Marta, who had come back from the kitchen one evening the previous week and sat on her bunk and said, in the quiet way she said all things, that Henderson had taught her an American recipe for cornbread, that she had made it herself that afternoon, and that it was very good, different from anything she knew, sweeter and denser than German bread, with a texture that was difficult to describe, and that she was going to write it down and keep it. She had said this without apparent larger meaning, in the same tone she might have used to report any practical information. But Ilse had understood that the keeping of the recipe was not about the bread. It was about the acknowledgement that something encountered on this side of the fence was worth carrying back, worth preserving, worth the small act of recording it in her own hand, so that it could travel with her when she eventually went home to whatever home had become. They were approaching the end of their third circuit of the yard when Renata said something that had been sitting in Ilse's own mind for days without finding its way into language. She said that what she kept returning to, lying in the infirmary at night with the sounds of the compound outside and the low light of the night nurse's lamp and the particular silence of a medical space in the small hours, was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it, and not guilt exactly, though guilt was part of it too, but something that sat between the two and was harder to name. The recognition that she had been given a story about the world that was not the world, and that the gap between those two things had nearly cost her the chance to discover the difference. That she had spent years inside a description of reality that served a particular purpose, and that she had inhabited that description with the unquestioning acceptance of someone who does not know they are inside a description because they have never been shown the outside of it. And that the outside of it, when it finally presented itself, had not presented itself as an argument or a refutation or an ideological counterposition, but simply as a man sitting beside a cot in the middle of the night, doing his job with competence and care, speaking to her as though she were a person worth speaking to carefully. Ilse stopped walking. Not dramatically. She simply stopped, and Renata stopped beside her, and they stood in the middle of the yard in the late morning sun, and Ilse looked at the infirmary building at the north end of the compound, the red cross on the roof catching the light, and she held what Renata had said alongside everything she had been accumulating since the road outside Regensburg, since the farmyard and the soup and the barn and the intake desk and the mess hall and the examination room and the step outside the infirmary where a man had closed his notebook briefly and said something about the war and the cost of it, and then opened his notebook again. All of it together. The full weight of it, which was not the weight of a single dramatic revelation, but the accumulated weight of many small ones, each unremarkable in isolation, each adding its increment to a total that had been building for weeks without her permission. She did not cry. She had not cried since the road, and she would not cry now, not because she was suppressing anything, but because what she was experiencing was not the kind of thing that produces tears, which tend to accompany acute events, sudden arrivals of emotion. What she was experiencing was something slower and more fundamental, a long, structural shift, the kind of change that happens below the surface, in the load-bearing parts of things, and that makes itself known not through eruption, but through the quiet and irreversible settling that follows when a false weight has been removed and the true shape of something can finally be seen. The Germany she had served was gone. She had known this intellectually since the surrender, since the news had moved through the barracks with its strange mixture of devastation and relief. But knowing it intellectually was different from knowing it in the way she was knowing it now, standing in this yard, which was that the Germany she had served had been built on a description of the world that the world itself had declined to confirm. Everything it had told her about who was dangerous and who was capable and who deserved what treatment under what circumstances had been tested, here, against actual evidence, and had failed the test so consistently and completely that the failure could not be attributed to exception or anomaly. It was systemic. The lie was structural. And the truth, assembled piece by piece over these weeks from observations so ordinary and undramatic as to seem almost insufficient to the size of what they were dismantling, was simply that the categories had been false, and the people placed inside them had always existed outside their boundaries, living their actual lives with actual competence and actual humanity in the space between what the categories claimed and what the world contained. She began walking again, and Renata walked beside her, and they completed the circuit in silence, and then stood near the entrance to the barracks building where the morning sun fell warmly on the stone wall. From inside the compound came the sound of a door and then footsteps, and Jarvis came out of the infirmary carrying his bag and his chart folder, moving toward the administrative building with his characteristic focused pace, reading as he walked, the stethoscope swinging slightly with each step. He did not look up. He had patients to attend to and notes to write and rounds to complete in a day full of the work that had been his before the war and would be his after it, the work that he had carried with him through everything and that existed entirely independently of what any government or doctrine or propaganda apparatus had ever said about what he was or was not capable of. Ilsa watched him cross the yard until he reached the administrative building and went inside, and then she looked at the door for a moment after it had closed behind him. And then she looked at the road beyond the fence, which was empty in the clear morning light, and at the fields beyond the road, where the spring grass was growing with the steady and indifferent abundance of things that do not wait for human events to resolve before continuing. Somewhere in those fields a bird was calling, the same bird or another bird, or perhaps birds had been calling every morning and she was only now hearing them clearly, now that certain other sounds had grown quieter. She turned and went inside. The barracks room was warm and carried the smell of the morning. Coffee from the mess hall still faint in the fabric of the walls, the wool of blankets, the clean wood of the shelf where her Schiller sat beside the small collection of objects she had accumulated since arriving. A button, a folded letter from home not yet replied to, a pebble from the road outside Regensburg that she had picked up without fully understanding why and had carried in her coat pocket until it had become too habitual to remove. She sat on her bunk and picked up the pebble and held it in her palm. It was unremarkable, gray and smooth, the kind of stone that exists in its millions on every road in Bavaria. She had picked it up on the morning of April 22nd, before the trucks came around the bend, when the world she had been living in was still technically intact. She had been carrying it since. She would carry it home, she thought, when home became a possibility again, not as a symbol of anything particular. Simply as a thing that had been with her through this, that had occupied the same coat pocket as her fear and her confusion and her slow, reluctant, necessary revision of the story she had been given about the world. A small gray stone from a road in Bavaria, picked up at the end of one thing and the beginning of something else, the nature of which she did not yet fully know and could not yet fully name, but that she understood, sitting in the warm morning light of the barracks room, to be real.